As a brand new hospice volunteer, I'd had extensive training but little hands-on experience with actual patients and their families. My first meeting with Tess, however, couldn't have been predicted, no matter how thorough the training might have been. As soon as I walked into her room, she took charge immediately and issued her first directive. "I want you to pour me 2 fingers of the vodka we keep in the freezer," she said, "and then I want you to go and sit in the living room until it's time for you to leave." "Okay," I replied, and exited the room with dignity and relief. 2 fingers of vodka wasn't exactly what I'd expected, but I could handle that.
That was poet and memoirist Mary Lyons. Hi, I'm Alan Rose. Welcome to Book Chat. And we're delighted to have Mary with us today. Mary, thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Alan.
Yeah, well, you are a memoirist, but you also teach memoirs. And it's an incredibly popular genre. So I wanted to spend some time talking with somebody who does it to tell us how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, how did you start writing memoirs?
I took a class up in Seattle at the Richard Hugo House. It's a writing colony, a group up there. And it was, I figured, okay, I can write memoir. And I had such a big life. You know, I had a lot of weird things happen in my life, and I thought, that could be a fun thing to explore. And so the class there was what really made me realize I could write.
Yeah.
You know, up until that point, I hadn't really seen myself as a writer, but it really, having that class forced me, to sit down at the keyboard, and do it. And I had to do it after the kids went to bed, but realizing that I could type on a keyboard, and I could never type on a typewriter. So that was a really amazing thing. And suddenly seeing that, look at that, I can really do a lot with this computer, and drag and delete and insert and do all kinds of things. And so it was a real exercise in my personal story and how to tell that story so that other people relate to it.
Yeah. Several years ago, I was asked by this Kelso School District to teach a class writing for middle school students. It was their Humanities and Arts Day. And so there were these delightful, maybe about 15 7th and 8th graders. And as we began, I opened up asking them, what they like to write. And it was pretty predictable. The boys were writing science fiction and the girls were writing poetry and fantasy. But there was this one little fellow, and when it was his turn, he said, "I'm writing my autobiography." And I thought, good for you.
Yeah, no
Only
kidding.
13, and he already knows that his life is a story.
Yep.
So I was impressed by that. And maybe we should ask, what's the difference between an autobiography and a memoir?
I think autobiography is more of the story, whereas the memoir has a vivid description of the inner workings of people and the scenes. It's more personal. It's more about the relationships and not simply the events. So you in memoir, you learn about the feelings. You learn about the emotions, but as well as all the senses. I think more in memoir than autobiography.
Autobiography can be sort of a bit detached, objective. And memoir can be much more focused with the feelings. Also, I think that when we talk about autobiography, we're probably talking about a life. Whereas with memoir, we're talking about generally an experience or a set of experiences.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's one of the encouragements, to people who want to write and they don't know how to start. Because when you think of a memoir, you think of, okay, I have my whole life. What do I take out of that? And that's one of the encouragements is to just pick a scene. Pick a moment, pick a memory in one scene with one person and write about that.
Don't try to do the whole life.
Don't do the whole thing, because it's overwhelming when you think about that. And then if you can just sit down and write, for half an hour, it once a day, and some story from your past. You'll be able to look at it later and say, look at that, this can go with that, And I think also not including everything. You don't have to tell everything. You don't have to tell about everybody in a memoir.
Once again, it's very focused.
Yes, exactly. Especially siblings. You don't have to talk about your siblings.
When in your class, how do you start? How do you begin working with a group of people to write their memoirs?
When we did it, when I've done it before, it's been an exercise. Writing Down the Bones is a wonderful book, and it talks about just sit down, put your pen to paper and write. For me, it works better to sit down at the keyboard and write. And I think that exercise of just stop thinking about it and just put yourself back there, think of a time in your childhood, a moment, a day in your childhood. Where were you? What was the setting? What did you look around and see? What people were in it? How did they sound? That kind of detail that brings back the memory of the scenes,
So sort of just immerse yourself into a memory and let it come forth.
Exactly, exactly. A lot of people don't remember their childhood. It's surprising how many people don't remember their childhood or much about their childhood. So you can go back to, how about when you were a teenager? Do you remember, don't we all have memories from high school, right? And, that were good and bad. And so I think that it's that tapping into who we were as the adult of who we are now, is a real valuable kind of tool when you're writing about it.
Probably then we would look for those emotional highs or lows, moments that have in our lives that have particular emotional power.
Yes, that stuck with us, that stuck with us. There was that scene with that kid next door. Remember that day, and remember what it smelled like, and remember all those things, and what his mother was yelling, and all that kind of detail that makes a story, a memoir, real, and it's not just telling about. You're in the writer's head and heart when you read a memoir.
What are some of the do's and don'ts that you suggest to people as they begin writing their memoirs?
I think the most important, from what I've seen, is don't sit down and proceed to write a whole memoir. Cut it into bits. Take small bites. Little story after little story to get started. I think that's the biggest obstacle for a lot of people, is that they don't know how to get started. And feel that when they start, they have to tell all the background of everything. And no, you don't. You can pick up Uncle Ed, farther down in the story. He can come in later. And so, but you don't have to tell me all about how Uncle Ed's, mother was, was your father's sister and she got a divorce. You know, it's like too much detail.
Really focused again on an experience.
Exactly, and because that's what the reader's going to identify with. You know, whose ex-wife is not going to be important, you know, whereas a scene where there's a heartfelt exchange, you know, between two kids or two adults that really touches the reader and tags a memory in the reader, you know, that tells them, I remember that, you know, I remember that. And
Hoping the memoir can generate within the reader his or her own memories of a similar experience.
Yes, or just a feeling, you know, just remembering what it was like to feel that, you know. And I think that it's challenging because you have to really put aside the facts. You know, that doesn't mean you're not telling the truth, but you can people, I think, get lost in, you know, it was probably August 7th, you know, and throw in dates and names and words and, you know, that are cities and details. The too much detail in a memoir, just, it disconnects that reader from the experience of the person whose voice you're reading. I think finding the voice was probably the most important and valuable thing for me in writing.
Finding the voice? You
know, your writing voice is a different voice than, you know, this voice, you know, as we're talking. And there's as a writer, there's a place where you can get to that you feel sincere about what you're saying. You're competent in that voice. You're comfortable there with the voice. And so in my writing, I can do a voice that is sad, and at the same time, it's still me. You know, I'm not trying to make somebody else feel something, but I am describing the scene and the story true to me and my heart.
I think it's common that it really does take time for one to find one's own voice, that you really have to experiment around and you're writing, and after a while you say, yes, that's me. That's me.
I find it, you know, and you start, and I think one of the things that we looked at, you know, was that your goal is to basically it's to sell your work, right? You know, so I think that, and I don't mean that necessarily financially, but you want to emotionally connect with the reader, even if you're writing, you know, not memoir, you know, if you're writing fiction or any kind of writing. And I think that writing voice of, okay, I can drop into that and I can talk about some things that might be painful, they might be worrisome, they might be embarrassing, they might be frightening, you know, and all of that is in memoir. And then it's, once you've got that voice developed personally, then you have more of a comfort level, and the reader can feel that. Right. The reader feels that. And I think that's where the exercise, you know, of what have I lost and what am I finding in this what I'm writing? And I think that that's a real core element of writing. You know, something's been lost and something's been found. What is that? And I think that the exercise of going through that with a voice that you're comfortable in helps the reader relax.
Right. So what resources have you found that would assist somebody who wanted to begin the process of writing her own memoir?
You know, I read, one of the first books I read was Writing Down the Bones,
Oh, yeah. Natalie Goldberg.
by Natalie Goldberg. And it was a wonderful crowbar. It was like a crowbar of getting me out of the, oh, I don't know how to do this, how can I start? And it was just pretty much just sit down, shut up, and write.
That's right.
You know, it's like, just stop thinking about it, stop worrying about it, just start writing, and write. And the exercise of writing continuously, I've done exercises of writing continuously without lifting the pen from the paper. Just, that's it, write, and to try and get that judge that we carry around. And memoir is tricky because you're seeing it, you're worried about whether or not the person that you're writing about, is going to be okay reading this. Are you going to be able to show it to the person? Are you going to be able to show it to anybody? And that's, I think, the difference between memoir and journaling. It's like,
right.
Just write down everything in journaling.
Right. And you pointed out beforehand that it's really helpful if the other person's dead.
It does. It helps a lot when they're gone, and
you don't have to worry.
No, that's it. Reference has left the room, So I think that, I think that writing about past individuals, and I think when I took the class at the Hugo House, it was, I took the class and we had these exercises and I wrote this and I wrote that, and then we finally had the final class. All the classes were going to do presentations, at the reading. We were all going to do a reading at the mic, and I hadn't written this story at all for the class, and I realized, this is why I took the class. It was to write this story about this woman and our experience together as she approached her death. And if I don't write it now, I may never write it. And so it was a real push on my part to get it written, and then to get up at the mic and read a piece that was pretty strong. It's a pretty strong piece, and that my instructor had never heard, was a real blindside for her. She was kind of mouth agape. It was it was a real freeing thing, though, because I knew I had it.
So there's both
I'd found the voice,
the writing of the experience, and then the sharing of the experience. Whether that's verbally sharing,
right,
like you did, or having somebody read it.
Yes, and I think that right, when in your classes and other classes, that you learn to read it out loud. Right. Read what you've written out loud, because that's so important, because you suddenly hear, those 18 thes, in one paragraph. Right, It's like, stop.
I found a really excellent resource in Mary Carr's book, The Art of Memoir. And of course, Carr has had best-selling memoirs, Liars Club, Lit, Cherry.
I loved Liars Club.
Yeah. And in The Art of Memoir, she both talks about her experience of writing memoir, but then also steps back as sort of a teacher and talks about the sort of the do's and the don'ts of it. And I found most helpful how she talked about dialogue in one's past.
Yeah.
And I know when I read certain memoirs and they've got their quotation marks, I'm thinking, oh, come on now, you were 3, you couldn't possibly remember that.
Yes.
And Mary Carr suggests take out the quotation marks.
I love that.
Yeah.
I loved that. That was a really great exercise for me, and I learned that in your class, And I think that it was all of a sudden, it was almost like taking off your hat. It's like, oh my goodness, we're in a very different place now of just capitals. A capital letter is going to mean a different voice, and and acknowledging that, okay, I remember the scene, I remember the feelings in the room, I remember the exchange going back and forth. Am I positive those were the exact words that used? Maybe not. But that person would probably be okay with me using those words to express that moment.
When you put the quotation marks, you're saying, this was said.
Yes.
When you take out the quotation marks and still have the dialogue, you're saying, it was sort of went like this.
Yes, yes. And that was what was conveyed to each other. The exchange happened in this form, without this detail.
How do you handle the issue about truth, what actually happened, and what I remember about that, and that there might be some disparity between the two?
I have to trust my heart. You know, that's the advantage of writing about dead people.
Yes. We hope they're not going to come back.
Yeah, no, I think that, you know, one of the pieces, you know, that I've written, you know, was about my ex-husband, and personally, I want to maintain relationships with the people I'm writing about, and so I will show them the piece and just let them know, not necessarily for correction or you know, any kind of criticism, but just as a courtesy.
This is how I remember it.
Yes, yes. I didn't want you to be blindsided if this goes farther than my computer. And you hear about it.
It was very brave of Mary Carr, as much as she's written about her past, that she admits in The Art of Memoir that her sister has a different recollection.
Yes.
And that's okay. She's writing about her memories.
Yes, and I think when I showed the piece of that I wrote about my ex-husband, when I showed him the piece, it was a really great conversation afterwards, because he said, you know, I don't remember it. I don't remember it. He said, I remember parts of it. I remember the afterwards, but I don't remember it happening. And then we talked about, you know, because it's a scene of domestic violence and drinking, you know, and you know, and he doesn't drink now, and so he's wise enough to know, you know, that I didn't make that up. I didn't make it up. And so I think that's where, when I'm talking about something that is a painful event, I'm usually pretty sensitive to helping the reader not be triggered or especially wounded about it.
There's a traumatic experience.
Yes. You know, I want to be gentle with the reader, you know, and not shock or, you know, great week to say this, or crucify, you know, the person I'm writing about. Right. You know, that's not what I have in mind. And so I think that, and I don't think that the reader wants to read that. You know.
What about some of your favorite memoirs, the ones that you either use as examples or recommend to people?
Yeah, I think that, you know, well, Angela's Ashes.
Angela's Ashes.
Of course, you know. Kafir Boy, you know, it was, my daughter went to South Africa and came back with some amazing stories about apartheid. And it was an autobiography, but it's also memoir. But and then it was also the Spike Walker. He was here in Longview, and you know his story. I loved coming back alive. It was great, you know, and I think that it was the outdoors part of it. You know, it was that strong, powerful nature in his stories, you know, about crab fishing in Alaska, and what that was like, you know, and the rescuing and all about the Coast Guard. And
at times memoirs can give us information about a world or a life that we are totally unfamiliar with, that can just really be informational as
It's
well
great.
as emotional.
Yes, or exciting, you know. This is a great guy's book,
Yeah.
you know. It's like, yay.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it's it keeps you turning the pages, you know.
I remember, I think probably one of the first memoirs I ever read, and I think people would not think about this, was the Confessions of St. Augustine. I was in college, and it was assigned reading, and I was amazed because here, Augustine, 400 A.D., around there, he is writing about his adolescence, and it could be true as of that day in terms of what the adolescent is struggling with. And I thought, this is amazing.
Yeah.
From the 5th century, this person is speaking to me about that, and I was so impressed with that. I've loved Russell Baker's Growing Up.
Growing Up is wonderful.
About coming of age in the Depression, and again, it's a time for my parents that they knew that period. I only knew it from what they've said, but he made it so real, talking about the experience of what it was like actually to live during those years.
Yeah.
So I really enjoy memoirs for that, that it gives me this sense of a whole life, different life that I would have no idea what it was like.
Yes. So, I like the contemporary memoirs too. I don't know if you've read Becoming yet by Michelle Obama.
No.
And I'm, it's like talk about on the top of my list, that and Mary Carr on writing memoir. And, those two, are really important to me. But I think that Michelle's is getting such great rave reviews from my friends and, from critics, that it's one of those books that it's just everybody's saying, oh, this is a good book, so.
As we close, what are there any special words of wisdom or encouragement that you would offer to somebody who's watching who thinks, I'd love to write that story about my grandmother?
Yeah.
What would you say?
I think one of the most important elements in my writing has been, and we've been doing it, we were talking about 8 years now, and that's our writers group. Find a writers group. Find, 2 or 3 other people that would like to write too, and see if you can't just get into a discipline of some kind, where you're going to just stop thinking about it and doing it. And I think writers' conferences are wonderful. I've been to the Pacific Northwest Writers Association up in Seattle. I've been to that as a visitor. I haven't been to the Willamette Writers yet, and but those writers' conferences, there's one locally, where is it, Centralia? Centralia, and I think just going and hearing these writers talk and see, okay, I'm not too far away from them.
I could do that.
I could do that. Or, I hadn't thought of doing it that way. I think that's the other thing, is to start seeing yourself as a writer is as important as doing it, So it's great.
Well, thank you, Mary. Thank you for
Alan.
Encouraging people to tell their stories.
It's important.
I think it's a way for us to hopefully keep understanding each other through sharing our stories.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you for being on Book Chat.
Thank you very much. It's been great.